Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. As we have the pleasure of having as our invited guest Mariano Machado from Maplecroft. Maplecroft is a risk analysis firm that does a lot of interesting things in looking at various countries across the world, including climate control risks and so forth. What I'd like is if Mariano could introduce himself and give us just a quick bit of snippets on what he does at Maplecroft, and then we'll dive in and look at the situation in Latin America, which is probably more interesting than it's been in a long period of time, and more complex to figure out for most of us who are sitting on the sidelines in some of the countries. But thank you for joining us, Mariano, and it's great to have you here.
Thank you, Walter. It's a true pleasure being here with you today. So Verisk Maplecroft is a global risk intelligence company providing unparalleled insight into resilience, sustainability, and ESG issues. All of this underpinned by best-in-class data and analytics. We work with numerous companies across the S&P 500 space, including energy majors, mining companies, and retail across the board. For the financial sector in particular, which I'm guessing might be the largest share of the audience for today's conversation, Maplecroft has just been named best specialist ESG ratings provider in recognition of our sovereign ESG rating tool, a tool that provides investors with the most comprehensive picture available in terms of ESG risks and opportunities across the entire current, but also potential sovereign issuer universe. In particular, I lead Maplecroft's research practice for the Southern Cone, including in-depth analysis for Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, assessing a wide range of global hemispheric trends, and also delivering global thought leadership on resource nationalism. This is the attempt of governments to exert further control on the exploitation of resources and profits associated with them. So very, very glad to be here today and looking forward to discussing all of these in today's conversation.
I'm sorry, I lost you there for a minute. I don't know if it was on my end. Well, I think the best way to kick off the conversation is to take a helicopter view of what's happening in Latin America. I mean, we have, what I could call, there was a song about 20 years ago called Bubbling Hot, Hot, Hot. And, if we scan from what's happening in Peru with the removal of Castillo and some of the violent protests you're seeing with Boluarte, we have Petro in Colombia, who's trying to use a very good year of growth to sort of push through two extremely controversial reforms in terms of health and pension fund reform. And of course we have Gabriel Boric, who's licking his wounds from a pretty big slap down on the constitutional reform, and is trying to sort of recapture some of his popularity that fell to as low as 25%. We've got Lula, who comes into office and suddenly has Bolsonaristas, running all over Brasilia and imitating what happened January 6th in the US. And of course, we have an important election cycle in Argentina, which is probably going to be wilder than any of these events that I just went through. I mean, from your perspective, what are some of the unifying themes? Even though the countries are very different, we do have some new left-wing leaders, showing some chutzpah and taking some risks and some challenges to try and transform their countries, but it doesn't seem to be going that well. So, how would you sort of synthesize what we're seeing? And I understand that there's just a lot going on right now.
It is a lot going on for sure. And I think the best way to find common denominator is basically on a relative position to the previous cohort of left-leaning leaders that we saw in the early noughties 20 years ago, as you mentioned, compared to now. Well, the key difference between the two of them is basically the inability to just deploy policy priorities. We're seeing completely different governments in terms of their political support base, in terms of the context in which they're trying to unfold these agendas, in terms of barely everything, with one sole exception: the opportunity in terms of then provision of energy in general. We're talking about the Chavez and Kirchner times, and Lula too, by the way, compared to now, in which beyond energy, we're talking about other type of critical resources. Besides that sole difference, the rest, you can compare it. We're looking at a different geopolitical context for Latin American governments. from a unipolar to a multipolar moment. We're looking at commodity prices, a boom 20 years ago, a much shakier outlook now. We're looking at low inflation back then, high inflation right now, flush coffers 20 years ago, now basically struggling to deliver on their promises. There's a number of differences that are threaded by this denominator of weakness. We're not seeing a single left-leaning government in the region, but we can talk about the non-left-leaning governments as well that has that ability, that cohesion within its own ranks, and in relative terms compared to the oppositions, much more solidified oppositions to just steamroll their priorities. That seems to be the key feature now affecting every single one of the countries you just mentioned.
Now, when you think about, a new leader, is that there's always a learning curve, and that, some of the left-wing presidents been elected, maybe fell into the illusion that they could suddenly, as you said, steamroll things and going through that. But, one of the great histories of Latin America over the last 30, 40 years, if you don't pay attention to the P's and Q's and otherwise the things that maintain economic stability, which is, some sort of fiscal coherence or discipline, monetary. I think most of the central banks are run by independent people, but, I think what we've seen is that some of these, new players or new presidents are having to learn as they go along that they're going to have to sort of give up some of their dream scenarios of converting the world to a more equal place and redistributing income to watching the P's and the Q's. And I think one of the most important examples of this is, if we talk about Lula in Brazil, Lula has a long history as Brazil's president. Lula 1 was great. It was coherent. Lula 2 was not so great and was very much a left-wing side. But how do you think that will play out as some of these leaders, get gray hairs and have, longer administrations? I mean, do you think they'll move more towards practicality and watching the P's and Q's, or do you think that their political survival depends on sort of addressing the demands of their bases?
The main example could be Chile's Gabriel Boric administration. After a year and change, after being elected in a very polarized runoff and bandwagoning on an overall tsunami of desire for meaningful change on behalf of society, the Boric administration continues to be ceaselessly enduring reality checks on every single angle and path that they try to just deploy decisions upon. So, and although the Boric's pragmatic shift to more centrist positions as a result of this, not only in terms of reformulating policy promises, but also actively including top names from previous Concertación governments, from the Bachelet administrations, is being welcomed by businesses and a large part of society. That is exactly triggering another set of conflicts, internal conflicts to be specific. In a nutshell, at the beginning, everyone was worried that Boric was perhaps going too much to the extremes, but now the extremes within his own coalition are actively questioning him for going too much to the center and just repeating previous centrist governments with no meaningful change in regards to those past examples. The main problem now is that even if you try to muscle through, Walter, even if you try to pay attention to the P's and Q's, as you were saying, someone in this larger than life coalitions is going to get angry. And that someone could actually have teeth. And that is precisely what is bombarding, if you want to, political stability prospects for all of these governments, left-leaning governments in the region.
We've talked about in conversations before this chat about a pink wave. And what in your view, I mean, if we think about the cycles, I mean, is this simply a bubbling up of inequality that has led to this wave of presidencies, that have been elected, or is it other issues that have to do with wider dissemination of social media? People have much more access to different information. Is that why do you think that the sort of rich versus poor narrative and some of the unrest, first we saw it in Chile, now we're definitely seeing it in Peru, and it seems to be there's some pushback now in Colombia on some of these reforms, but This cycle that has sort of evolved, is it that? Is it inequality? Is it, rich versus poor? Or is it that people were simply just sick of the incumbents and want some sort of change, and they go for what we call the new shiny penny, that, hits certain touch points that resonate with certain parts of the society?
That's another critical question to understand what's going on, because our research and basically data across the region in terms of political identity and how people perceive themselves in the different countries we've been discussing shows that the third working hypothesis you just shared with us, this is the, sick of the incumbent type of narrative, and voting for those resonating talking points that basically bring back in some cases, some good memories from the past, or at least some expectations around the future. That seems to be the main driver of this new, we call it the pink tide wave we're seeing, because there's not a single explanatory factor except for this one, that notion of um, you have decades of stagnation, you have decades of unfulfilled promises. Then suddenly you have people getting into office in different countries, namely Argentina, one of them, Brazil, different characteristics, but you know what I mean. In Ecuador, even in Uruguay, much stable Uruguay, you have people going into office and promising to break that cycle and to actually take that developmental leap and take those countries into a new stage. Well, then, unsurprisingly to a degree, that doesn't happen. So what's next in line in terms of who might be able to at least provide that degree of certainty, or at least, again, happy times that we were talking about just a few minutes ago? Well, we believe that this, in some cases, old dogs, not necessarily all of them old, but they were very tactful in terms of just capturing that sentiment and riding that back into office. But the true question, and some countries are more advanced, some countries are less advanced in this degree, is that the anti-incumbent sentiment hasn't evaporated. It's still very much there, especially given the results that each of these administration has been reaping. Some of them, as Argentina, close to finishing their terms. Some of them on the first, half of them. In the case of Chile, again, some of them very recent, like Petro in Colombia. But all in all, that social patience running thing, that ticking bomb in terms of social pace, is very much there. None of the actors I just mentioned has been able to deactivate that. The same could be applied for Brazil and Lula as well. He's been playing the blame game since he took office, with reason to a degree, of course, because of the novelties and new developments and new actors that took place. But all in all, the blame game that now is ongoing with the central bank, president, and so on and so forth. There's always that degree of trying to cushion myself because I know that I'm not going to be able to deliver on that. But the true question now that we're making ourselves is that if we're looking at the consolidation of what we could call alternation, political alternation in these countries, this political color is going to lose, then the previous one or the next one comes along, but both of them belong to the democratically respectful type of political forces, that participate and recognize elections, or if we are on the verge of a massive wave of outsiders getting into office. If you think about that, this has already been happening in some countries. Bolsonaro was not entirely an outsider in the case of Brazil because he was part of the blob, if you call it, for a long time as a federal lawmaker. But you could consider him as a non-central political figure compared to the others. Pedro Castillo in Peru, 20 candidates at some degree in that election. Nobody was expecting Castillo to reach office, and he did. Uh, Boric, again, you cannot call him an outsider per se. Some features, though, but not entirely. So the question now is, between alternation and just paving the way for outsiders. If polarization continues to be the name of the game, which seems that every single president in the region is playing, well, there seems to be a lot of evidence to think that this is exactly the ripe environment for outsiders to just squeeze into office.
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about it, outsiders are the first derivative of, all of what's been happening. And I do consider, I spent a lot of time in Brazil many years ago, is that, Bolsonaro was an outsider in the sense that his personality, his approach, some of the issues that he hit on were were clearly revolutionary in typical Brazilian politics. And this experimentation phase, I mean, you mentioned the situation in Peru with the fragmentation that appeared in that country. But when we turn to places like Argentina, as we sit at the cusp of what's going to be a long and painful roller coaster ride of elections, is that I think what we could be seeing is that there's an enormous amount of interest, and I would say trepidation, around Javier Milei's emergence. And Milei is, as a very boisterous and flamboyant personality, but he does not have a political apparatus behind him, and I don't think he yet has a mindset of building alliances to try and truly reach the presidency. But we have a situation in which the electorate is extremely angry. There is going to be a repudiation vote in the PASO and probably in the first round. But at the end of the day, is that the polarization exists, but it's not necessarily in many of these countries the same traditional 2 or 3 parties. Is that you have the emergence of a monster that you just don't know how big its tail is, and how much fire it breathes and so forth, because it's newly forming. And I think that while some people would like to break the polarization in Latin American politics that has existed for year and year, to get some new blood, some new ideas, and maybe get some across the aisle, consensus building, I think we're a long way from that. But I think that the outsider issue, particularly now as we're the next election in Argentina, is a little bit unsettling, particularly because these outsiders that are emerging don't have all the skills. They don't have the representation in the legislative bodies. And in some cases, their policy platforms are not able to be implemented. And if they were implemented, would cause the countries to blow to shreds. And so I think that it will be a test, I think, in this next round of elections in Argentina, to see how far Milei's phenomenon goes, how deep into the process, because if he goes very deep into the process, it could be disruptive to any electoral math or any power sharing that we can envision for the next 4 years.
Completely in agreement. And actually, when you look at the region to try to map out potential paths for Argentina in terms of outsiders and how disruptive they are during the electoral time, but equally important, if not more important, after the election, regardless of their own results, is like how much firepower they hold after the election itself. Well, none of the examples available are actually great. I can think of 2 very polar examples, polar opposite examples, as we were talking about. Peru, on the one hand, you have a clear outsider, and then you have subsequent incredible degree of instability when it comes to Peruvian politics. Even in Peruvian terms, incredible degree, outlier, like 3 standard deviations degree of instability in Peru. And then you have the Bolsonaro example, which is a very different one, because for all the things we might remember Jair Bolsonaro during his presidency, he proved to be very savvy in terms of broken agreements and being able to push some of the reforms and being able to concede power in order to just continue to be in power. Of course, the why, the end game of that, it's completely debatable. But in the end, he did finish the term. He did rely himself against Congress. He did put people even in the Supreme Court in Brazil, and he has left a legacy. So these
and
are
he
very,
also
very
had one of the best economy ministers in Latin America, who built a 2.4% primary surplus. So even amidst all his crazy time politics, his economic policy was relatively strong on the P's and Q's. I think that I agree with you. He had a rocky road, but when I look at what Guedes did on the fiscal side of things, it was pretty remarkable, given Bolsonaro's sort of controversial reputation in Brazil at the time.
And I think that Guedes' agenda up to the half of the term, perhaps 3 years into the term, was a very vivid one. We discussed this with our clients in depth. They had expectations about the tax reform in the case of Brazil after the pension reform passed in 2019. But all in all, in the end, the name of the game ended up being survival, political survival, and not delivering on reform. So that's one way of moving ahead when it comes to outsiders. So the question now is, if we witness the intrusion of this particular outsider we're discussing in the case of Argentina, not trying to be polar, pun intended here, these are not the only two paths that this outsider may take after taking office if that happens, but they tend to shed light about what to expect about this. On the one hand, you can expect continuous instability. Peru and Argentina have a lot of difference in terms of their institutionality and how Congress is organized, besides institutional features. Whereas in the case of Brazil, when you look at that, the power brokerage exercise that Bolsonaro conducted could be something that, of course, is going to put off a major part of Milei's base because he was not elected to do pork barrel politics. That's for sure. If that happens, that is not going to be the reason why he's going to be elected. But in terms of stability, I could see that happening in terms of self-preservation. Is that good? A good news for businesses and investors? Still uncertain, as you say it. A very patchy policy blueprint when it comes to this type of candidates. Very catch-all in terms of the discourse and the narrative, but when it comes to the nitty-gritty of it, when you need to sit down and negotiate, we have a number of questions that remain unsolved. We have talked to a lot of people in that camp, and we're still very much not satisfied with the questions we are obtaining on that. So a lot of interrogants on that regard.
If we could take this sort of scope out, as a sort of final topic, is that you talked about a multipolar world. Obviously, the US and China are at odds, and China would like to get its tenterhooks, deeper into Latin America as they've done in Africa and other places. Is that if, let's say, the elections go as we expect, and we have a Juntos por el Cambio president in Argentina. I'm sitting here today in Uruguay, and I think Lacalle Pou is the best president in Latin America today, but it's quite possible, even likely, that he may lose to the Frente Amplio. So from the State Department standpoint, is that in 2 years, we could be looking at a Latin America that is covered in pink, to use your words, and that Argentina may be sort of the lone large state that could be governed by a center or right government. Assuming Joe Biden leaves office, which is again an assumption I would make, but not everyone would make, is that, do you think it's possible that the State Department and the U.S. would embrace a new administration in Argentina with both arms, as one, potentially a new supplier of LNG, a new supplier of lithium, and so forth, but basically as a firewall against all of this left-wing movement that's swept Latin America? I mean, I think that Lula is probably gonna be much more centrist than people expect. I mean, because he's an experienced politician, and he wants PT to stay in power after being out for a long period of time. But how do you see that, that once we get through the Argentine election, most of the presidents have at least, 1 to 3 more years of in office, is that how does Latin America then fit into this geopolitical, situation that's building?
It's a very interesting question, because I think if we'd had the discussion like a year ago, or perhaps a year and a half ago, my responses would be completely different than they are now. But what we're seeing beyond narratives and assumptions about alignment, if you want to, is we're seeing active efforts on behalf of every single country in the region to avoid alignment, to actively walk a tightrope in terms of just reaping the benefits of every single major trade and investment relationship that they have with any of the hegemonic actors, if you want to call it like that the world has to offer right now. And for the first time in a long time, we're also seeing some degree of acceptance, if you will, on behalf of these actors in terms of this cohabitation in the region. To resume it, in a nutshell, nobody's marrying with anyone, basically. We're seeing Juntos por el Cambio governors, I'm sorry for the language, but flirting with equally with Ambassador Mark Stanley on the one hand and the US companies, and literally 3 hours later announcing major investments from private companies from China, in example. We're seeing Russian companies operating in the lithium space in Argentina with barely any restriction, or even buying up Canadian companies in that regard. And at the same time, that is taking place in jurisdictions that could be ruled by Peronism or not. It's a very uh, bombastic moment in that regard, in which there are no rules when it comes to alignment. And I don't think that's going to change in the short term, because the incentives that each of these actors can present and how they prioritize Latin America in their foreign policy pipelines, if you want to, would not allow them to just call in, and call dibs, if you want to, on the region, and acting as a repellent to other type of actors trying to just either state-driven actors just trying to enter the region more vehemently, or even private actors with sharing that flag going into the region and just doing business, as it is increasingly happening. I don't see that capability right now from any actor to say, this is our territory, you cannot go into here. Rather, what I'm seeing is that there is this slow but steady degree of acceptance of, we are going to be present and we're going to be doing things in here, and we might as well try to align incentives in a way that steer these jurisdictions more closer to us than closer to them, if you will. But the ultimate result is going to be an active pushback on behalf of any administration. And I have a couple of examples of this. I think that below the surface, we tend to believe that Alberto has been an example, the presidency of the FDT more aligned with China because of a lot of reasons, trying to get into the BRICS, trying to get into the Belt and Road Initiative and achieving that, the role of Ambassador Vaca Narvaja in Beijing. There's a lot of ways to observe that, as they want to go this way. But exactly at the same time, they have been slowly weaving relationships with the entire State Department, not only since Massa is Minister of Economy, but way before that. They've been playing in a good way, not in a bad way, both sides, and that has been successful. The same with Europe. The visit of German Chancellor Scholz just a couple of weeks ago, they have been able to do that because of the current context. We do not expect that to change, even if we had a Juntos por el Cambio government as a lone ranger in the region, because the region itself is not showing um, sending any signals about being willing and able to just leave money on the table, if you will. So we expect that much more continuity in that regard than change. And that is not necessarily a bad thing when you think about it. But the problem is, this is an ongoing debate, an ongoing conversation. There might come a time during Argentina's next administration in which the interlink between different issues, investment, trade, supporting multilateral fora, might come to a point in which strategic competition steps in and says, you need to take a stance. You need to make a decision. That is very much on the cards. So far, that hasn't happened. And I think that on behalf of the US, you can look at that as results is Argentina's ability to renegotiate the debt with the IMF. You cannot explain that without the support of the US. You cannot explain a lot of things without the support of different
That
actors.
if that went into it, it would probably mean that the tensions between China and the United States have escalated to a whole new level. I mean,
Exactly.
the
And that is
Chinese
completely
already
on the
have
table.
significant penetration, but I think it's a sign of maturity is that, FDI, back in the 90s was much more buoyant in Latin America than it is today. I just looked at the numbers. Argentina only captured $570 million in FDI. I mean, Brazil gets that in a couple of weeks. So it's better that they have a lot of different, partners on their dance cards, but it is positive that there is that maturity in terms of the diplomatic corps to understand is that, there's no reason to make a choice from one to the other. And certainly Argentina is the case that they shouldn't be making that choices. So as a final observation, I mean, are you optimistic over the next 12 to 24 months that even though we have this learning curve of some of these new presidential administrations, clearly Peru is in an unstable situation right now, but it looks as though some of the other countries are in sort of what we would call stable equilibriums. Do you think that things get a little bit more solid from here, or do you think we're headed for a little bit more of bubbling hot, over the next couple of years?
I must say, I am an optimistic, but the thing is, I'm in pause right now, and there's little evidence to get me out of pause in this regard. What worries me is that things might go down exactly as you say, Walter. We might see some things improving or getting worse. But what really worries me is um, instability becoming the norm, much as in the case of Argentina, in which no one knows what actually can blow up, what can be the spark that blows up the power keg. That is the scenario that worries me, because we have get used in Latin America in terms of economic stagnation and the inability to take those I mentioned before, those developmental jumps, if you want to. But now we might be seeing a witness in the early stages of a new era in which this type of stability becomes the norm, and we just get used to it. And actually we need to navigate that and help clients, businesses and investors to navigate that, because there is no such thing as a risk-free launch in the world right now. And this region, with all of the things that you might call it upon in terms of not being um, the best region to do in business, compared to other regions in the world, could be a very good place, just to lay grounds and start to look at it again. So I cannot say that I'm completely optimistic right now. I'm curious. I will leave with that.
Well, great. Well, once again, I want to thank you for taking the time with us. I think you've made some fantastic observations and have helped us sort of, frame our minds on what's going on in Latin America. Clearly we could talk for hours and hours about what's going to be happening in different places, but I appreciate you taking the time, and, hopefully we can get you on again as time permits, and good luck with with your heavy analysis that you're going to have to be doing in the next 6 to 12 months. But I really appreciate you taking the time.
Our pleasure. Anytime.